younger, I had Barbies, dollhouses, and other girly toys, but I chose to play with my brother's toys more, especially his Nerf guns, because I thought they were more fun. Even though this was the case, I was still clearly gifted toys meant for girls at every single birthday party. Even in the Target toy section and other places like that, we can see there's a clear divide between the girls' toy section and the boys' toy section, with toys on the left generally being seen in the girls' toy section and toys on the right generally being seen in the boys' toy section. Now this tells me that people tend to stick to things labeled for their gender because it is the norm and it is what we are socialized to do. Now, take for instance when Harry Styles wore a dress on the front cover of Vogue. It was such a jaw-dropping moment because we see a man on the front cover of a fashion magazine wearing a dress. And for the most part, we have been socialized to see a woman in this position. Now, what do I mean by socialized? Well, we learn and form beliefs about expectations and norms for our gender in a process called gender socialization. And when I say we, I mean everybody on the earth, from everybody in this room, to politicians, to celebrities, and even serial killers. Yes, I just said serial killers and how everybody in this room has something in common to them by us all being socialized. In my thesis, I studied the crimes and upbringing committed by 4 different serial killers, 2 males and 2 females. From there, I compare and connect their crimes and their upbringings to the time period in which they lived. And then I discovered the time period in which they lived influences how they were socialized. And how they were socialized may have influenced how and why they committed the crimes. So now let's investigate 2 serial killers I researched in my thesis. One extremely well known, and the other one y'all probably haven't heard of. But let's start off with the one y'all haven't heard of. This is Jane Toppin. She was born in 1854 to impoverished parents. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father was an abusive alcoholic. When she was still a child, her father left her at Boston Female Asylum, where she spent the first 2 years of her life until a woman named Abner Toppin adopted her. Now, even though she was adopted into the Toppin family, she still felt like a misfit. Fast forward several years later, and Jane Toppin is a smart young woman attending Columbia University. She is seen as an exceptional student there, and she is so exceptional that she ends up attending nursing school. Now, during her time in nursing school, a change in her behavior occurred, and she developed very unusual tendencies, such as the fact that she became a pyromaniac, which is the obsessive compulsion to start a fire. Now, these unusual tendencies went unnoticed because she was a typical background character in society since she was a woman. Now, after her time in nursing school, she became a private nurse at a hospital, working the night shift. This gave her very one-on-one access to patients, and she was able to gain their trust, and they may have even seen her as a friend. Now, using this trust, she would poison her patients in very small increments and over an extended period of time. She led the uppers at the hospital to believe that her patients were dying of natural causes. Now, there are some clues in her case that tell us how women were socialized during the time. So, she lived during the mid-19th century, and during this time, women were subjected to housework unless they were a caretaker or nurse. Women were seen as innocent, virtuous, and motherly, and if they wanted to do anything in society, they had to be discreet about it. They couldn't be upfront like men. Now, the norms for Jane Toppin worked perfectly for her, because no one would suspect a woman who's supposed to be virtuous and innocent to be responsible for any kind of crime, especially a crime like murder. The norms for Jane Toppin and women of her kind worked perfectly for her and her urge to kill. Now, let's investigate Ted Bundy, who's if not one of the most infamous serial killers of the 20th century, along with Jeffrey Dahmer. And like myself, I bet most of y'all here have heard of Ted Bundy through popular Netflix documentaries, such as the one starring Zac Efron. So, Ted Bundy was born in 1940 to a single mother. He depended on his grandfather to have any sort of father figure in his life when he was young, and his childhood got pretty rough when his mother decided to move him and herself to Washington to marry a man named Johnny Bundy. Now, her and Johnny had his sister, and after they had his sister, he begins to feel neglected. And as he's growing up, and when he becomes a teenager, his father starts to become more emotionally abusive towards him as he becomes more openly defiant towards him. Now, his school life is no better than his home life. He is pretty much a loner, and he feels quite inferior, and he starts to feel a little bit infuriated about how his life is going. But things start to look up for him when he goes to college and starts dating a gorgeous, rich California socialite named Marjorie Edwards. And she's basically everything he isn't. Now, he thought this relationship with Marjorie would be his way out of this inferiority and this infuriation that he's been feeling throughout his life. But it wasn't, because when he proposed to her, she said no. Now, infuriation is especially a strong emotion, especially when there's nobody to tell. Now, all these feelings came back to him, and the psychopath in him emerged, and he became a charmer, but with the urge to kill. So he would stalk women that looked like Marjorie. He would lure them out to his car and pretend to be someone in need of help, like someone injured. From there, he would abduct them, and I can bet that y'all can imagine the heinous things that occurred after this, but I'm not going to get into it. So, there are some clues in his case that tell us how he was socialized. For one thing, he lived in the mid-20th century, and during this time, boys were taught that as men they should be successful, head of the household, and have wives that took care of the kids. And these expectations for men were taught to boys through watching their father and by watching television, but mainly through watching television. And one television show that encapsulates the expectations of men during the time was Leave It to Beaver. And like many other family-centered TV shows, it often depicted the father leaving in a suit early in the morning to go off to work. And while he was gone at work, the mother stayed home, took care of the kids, did dishes, and other household chores. And when the father returned later in the day, the mother would still be doing these things. Now, Bundy was raised under these expectations for men of his time, but did he quite reach them? Not at all. For one thing, his ex-girlfriend had more success than him, and people would have looked up to her more because she came from a very socially elite family. And also, Ted Bundy failed out of law school, which was pretty embarrassing during the time, especially when men were supposed to be successful. Now, why am I talking about serial killers in relation to socialization? Well, we can see that even in inhumane and bizarre behaviors outside the everyday norm, that everyone is a product of how they've been socialized. Just like us, serial killers have been socialized. Now, I'm not saying that socialization is a bad thing and that people who are socialized are going to become serial killers. I'm just saying that it's something that we need to know exists because it persists in everybody. So, just like me as a little girl, we can choose what to believe and what not to believe. We do not have to be slaves to every norm or construct that society has for us. We do not have to be what society expects us to be. We can be the outliers.